Rarity is often misunderstood. It is usually measured by price, reputation, or how often a gemstone appears in high-end collections. By those standards, a blue sapphire is frequently placed among the rarest and most valuable stones in the world. And in many cases, that assumption holds. But that definition relies on visibility, on what can be seen, traded, and recognized. In a small region of Southern California, a different kind of rarity exists, not defined by demand, not driven by market value, and in some cases, not even accessible in any practical sense. These are minerals that do not follow the same rules. Some are rarely encountered because they form under highly specific conditions. Others are absent from the market entirely, not because they are withheld, but because there is nothing to circulate. And a few exist at the edge of probability itself. This is where the usual scale begins to fail. Because beyond a certain point, rarity is no longer about how valuable something is, but whether it can be found at all. What follows is not a list of the most expensive stones or the most recognizable names. It is a progression, one that moves from what is considered rare to what almost never appears, to what in some cases nearly never existed in the first place. And by the end, the difference between owning one of these minerals and never seeing it at all may be far smaller than expected. Don't forget to press and hold that like button, leave a comment, and hit subscribe before we begin. Ranked 10th, Benitoite. Existential rarity. Tease early, pay off hard. There is one mineral in Southern California that quietly defies everything most people understand about rarity. It is known as Benitoite. At first glance, that name may not carry the same weight as a blue sapphire. It does not dominate jewelry stores. It is rarely discussed outside specialized circles. And yet, when placed on a true rarity scale, it occupies a position that sapphire never reaches. But the reason is not what most expect. Benitoite is not defined by price, prestige, or demand. Its defining characteristic is far more difficult to quantify because it begins long before the stone is ever seen. Its existence depends on a convergence of geological conditions so specific that even slight variation prevents it from forming at all. The chemistry must align precisely. The pressure and temperature must fall within an extremely narrow window. The surrounding environment must remain stable long enough for the crystal structure to develop without interruption. If any of those factors shift, even slightly, the result is not a lower quality specimen. It is the complete absence of benitoite. There are no global deposits supplying a steady flow, no widespread mining operations producing consistent output. Instead, nearly all known gem-quality material traces back to a remarkably small area within California, an origin so limited that it effectively locks the mineral in place. Over time, a small number of specimens have entered private collections or institutional archives. Many are rarely displayed. Some are documented more often in literature than in physical view. For most collectors, benitoite is not part of an acquisition strategy. It is a boundary, one that defines the edge of what can realistically be found. And this is where comparison begins to break down. Because while sapphire remains rare in the context of value, benitoite exists in the context of probability. One can be searched for, studied, and eventually obtained. The other depends on whether the right conditions ever aligned in the first place. This is the point where the rarity index reaches its limit. Not because benitoite cannot be ranked, but because ranking assumes availability. Here, there is almost none. Some minerals are rare. Some are extraordinarily rare. But benitoite represents something else entirely. A category where rarity is no longer measured by how often something appears, but by how easily it could have never existed at all. Ranked 9th, Neptunite, private world. Long before rarity reaches its final threshold, there is a stage where access quietly disappears. Not in theory, but in practice. This is where certain minerals stop circulating, stop appearing, and gradually slip out of public view altogether. One of the clearest examples is Neptunite. Unlike more familiar gemstones, Neptunite was never widely distributed to begin with. Its occurrences have always been limited, often appearing alongside far more publicized minerals. For a brief period, a small number of specimens entered the hands of collectors, enough to establish its presence but never enough to sustain visibility. And then something subtle happens. It stops showing up. Not because it no longer exists, but because it no longer moves. There are no consistent listings, no predictable appearances in auctions, no steady trickle into the market. Instead, the few high-quality specimens that were discovered have gradually settled into long-term ownership, private collections, institutional holdings, or estates where they remain largely unseen. For most observers, this creates an illusion. It begins to feel as though the mineral itself has vanished, but in reality, it has simply become inaccessible. That distinction matters, because rarity at this level is no longer defined by how much exists, but by how little can be encountered. A mineral may still be present somewhere in the world, yet functionally invisible to anyone outside a very narrow circle. Neptunite operates within that space. Even those with years of experience in mineral collecting may never encounter a notable specimen in person, not due to lack of effort, but because opportunity itself has become scarce. And when access disappears, something else takes its place. Exclusivity. Not as a status symbol, but as a condition of reality. There is no path to reliably acquire it, no timeline to wait for, no guarantee that another opportunity will ever present itself. Only the knowledge that somewhere in carefully controlled environments, these crystals still exist. Seen by few, handled by fewer, and entirely absent from the broader world. At this point, rarity begins to change its meaning. It is no longer about searching harder. It is about recognizing that some minerals are simply no longer part of the search at all. Ranked 8th, Jeremejevite. Jeremejevite exists at a level of rarity that even experienced mineral collectors may never encounter, especially when viewed within the context of minerals associated with Southern California. At first glance, it doesn't appear remarkable. Its color is often pale blue or nearly colorless, sometimes mistaken for more familiar stones like aquamarine or even quartz. And that is precisely what makes it so deceptive. It does not signal rarity in the way most gemstones do, but that quiet appearance hides a far more complex reality. While blue sapphire is considered rare due to its global value, recognition, and demand, Jeremejevite operates on an entirely different level of rarity, one defined not by market presence, but by the probability of formation itself. In geological environments connected to Southern California, minerals like Jeremejevite depend on an extremely narrow set of conditions. The chemical composition must align precisely. Temperature and pressure must remain stable within a limited range, and the surrounding environment must remain undisturbed long enough for crystals to develop. If even one of these variables shifts, the result is not a lower quality specimen. It is no Jeremejevite at all. Even when those conditions are met, the outcome is rarely significant. Most crystals are small, incomplete, or lack the clarity required to be considered notable. As a result, there is no consistent supply, no reliable discovery pattern, and almost no presence in the broader market. The few specimens that do exist are often absorbed quickly into private collections or institutional archives, where they remain largely unseen. This creates a paradox. Even among collectors focused on Southern California minerals, Jeremejevite is not something actively pursued, because there is no predictable way to find it. It is not part of a search strategy. It is an exception. At this point in the rarity index, the definition of rarity begins to shift. Blue sapphire, while rare, can still be studied, sourced, and eventually acquired through established channels. Jeremejevite cannot. It exists in a space where rarity is no longer about effort or access, but about whether the right conditions ever aligned in the first place. And that difference changes everything. Ranked 7th. Serandite. Visual deception. Appearance in mineralogy is often treated as a reliable guide. Color, clarity, and form tend to signal value, rarity, and identity with a level of consistency that both collectors and casual observers learn to trust. Over time, that visual intuition becomes almost automatic, an internal system for recognizing what matters and what does not. And that is precisely where certain minerals disrupt expectations. One example is Serandite. At a glance, Serandite does not immediately command attention in the way more familiar gemstones do. Its coloration can appear subdued under certain lighting conditions, and its crystal habit does not always present the symmetry or brilliance typically associated with high-value materials. To an untrained eye, it may resemble something far more common, an ordinary specimen among many. But that impression is misleading, because rarity in this case is not expressed through visual dominance. It exists beneath the surface, in the mineral's limited formation environments and the narrow conditions required for its development. High-quality Serandite crystals, those with clarity, structure, and saturation, are not only uncommon, but exceptionally difficult to encounter in meaningful quantity. This creates a disconnect between perception and reality. A mineral that appears modest can, in fact, be far less accessible than something that looks far more valuable. The visual hierarchy breaks down, replaced by a deeper understanding that cannot be assessed in a single glance. For experienced collectors, this introduces a different kind of challenge. Not the difficulty of acquiring something obvious, but the discipline of recognizing what is easily overlooked. In some cases, specimens have been passed over simply because they did not signal their significance strongly enough. In others, their rarity has only been fully appreciated after closer examination, long after initial impressions were formed. Serandite exists within that gap, a mineral that does not announce itself, yet quietly occupies a position far beyond what its appearance suggests. It does not compete for attention, and in many cases, it does not receive it, until it is understood. And once that understanding is established, the visual simplicity that once diminished it begins to take on a different meaning, not as a limitation, but as a form of concealment. A reminder that rarity is not always something that can be seen immediately, and that, at times, the most uncommon materials are the ones least likely to reveal themselves at first glance. Ranked 6th. Kunzite. Geographic isolation. Distribution in most cases determines access. When a mineral forms across multiple regions, even in small quantities, it maintains a degree of visibility. Specimens move, new finds appear. Opportunities, however limited, continue to exist. But when formation is confined to a narrow geographic boundary, that dynamic changes entirely. This is where Kunzite begins to separate itself. Kunzite has long been associated with a specific part of California, particularly within the historic pegmatite deposits of San Diego County. For a period, this region produced crystals of exceptional size and clarity, enough to establish the mineral's identity and reputation among collectors and gemologists. Yet that period did not sustain itself. Over time, production declined, not gradually, but decisively. The geological conditions that once yielded high-quality material did not extend outward, nor did they replicate elsewhere at comparable scale. What remained was not a distributed resource, but a localized phenomenon, one tied to a finite set of formations within a clearly defined area. That limitation carries lasting consequences. Unlike minerals that can be sourced from multiple continents, Kunzite's finest specimens are inseparable from their origin. Without access to those specific deposits, the probability of encountering equivalent material decreases sharply. This is not simply a matter of rarity, it is a matter of location. Collectors cannot expand the search indefinitely. There is no broader field to explore, no alternative region offering similar output. The mineral does not exist in parallel systems. It remains anchored to the conditions that created it, conditions that have proven difficult to reproduce in any meaningful way. As a result, high-grade Kunzite has become increasingly constrained, not only in quantity, but in accessibility. Existing specimens circulate less frequently, and new discoveries, when they occur, rarely match the quality of earlier finds. For those outside the immediate geographic context, the mineral becomes progressively harder to encounter. Not because it is intentionally restricted, but because its existence has always been tied to a place that cannot be expanded. This is the defining characteristic of geographic isolation, a form of rarity that does not rely on time or demand, but on the fixed boundaries of the Earth itself. And once those boundaries are reached, the search does not continue elsewhere. it simply ends. Ranked 5th, Dumortierite, misidentified value. Recognition often determines perceived importance. When a mineral aligns with familiar expectations, distinct color, strong brilliance, immediate visual appeal, it is more likely to be identified, valued, and preserved. That recognition creates a pathway from discovery to appreciation, reinforcing its place within the broader understanding of rarity. But not every mineral follows that path. Some exist in forms that do not immediately signal significance, blending into categories that are already well understood. Their presence is acknowledged but not examined closely enough to reveal what makes them uncommon. This is where Dumortierite, particularly when found as inclusions within quartz, begins to challenge assumptions. At first glance, such specimens are often categorized simply as quartz, one of the most abundant minerals on Earth. The presence of fibrous blue or violet inclusions may be noted, but rarely treated as the defining feature. To an untrained observer, it remains a familiar material with minor variation. That initial classification obscures a more complex reality. Dumortierite itself forms under specific conditions, and its occurrence within quartz requires an additional level of alignment, one that allows the mineral to develop while being encapsulated within another host crystal. The result is not merely decorative, but structurally uncommon. Well-formed inclusions with distinct coloration and distribution are far less frequent than the surrounding quartz would suggest. This creates a disconnect between expectation and actual rarity. A specimen may be overlooked because its host is common, even though the internal structure represents a far more limited occurrence. In some cases, such pieces have been passed over entirely, dismissed as variations of a familiar mineral rather than recognized as composite formations with their own level of scarcity. For collectors and researchers, this introduces a subtle but significant challenge. It is no longer sufficient to identify the primary mineral alone. The context in which it appears becomes equally important, requiring closer observation and a willingness to question initial assumptions. Dumortierite in quartz occupies that space. A mineral expression that does not rely on external prominence but instead exists within layers, visible yet easily underestimated. And once that distinction is understood, the value shifts. Not because the material has changed, but because the perspective has. Rarity in this case was never absent. It was simply misidentified. Ranked 4th. Tourmaline. Collector frustration. Persistence in most areas of collecting tends to produce results. Given enough time, resources, and access, even difficult specimens can eventually be located. The process may take years, but it remains grounded in a predictable assumption that continued effort will lead to opportunity. That expectation begins to falter when dealing with certain varieties of tourmaline associated with Southern California. Historically, the pegmatite districts of this region produced tourmaline crystals that were both visually striking and structurally significant. For a time, these deposits supplied the market with material that shaped the perception of what high-quality tourmaline could be. Color saturation, crystal size, and clarity established a benchmark that collectors continue to reference. But that period does not reflect the present. The conditions that once yielded those specimens have not repeated with the same consistency. Many of the most productive localities have been extensively worked, leaving behind a landscape where new discoveries are increasingly rare and often limited in quality. This shift creates a gap between expectation and reality. Collectors entering the field encounter a historical record rich with examples, yet face a current environment where similar pieces are seldom available. The contrast is not immediately apparent, but it becomes clear over time, especially after extended searching yields little to no comparable material. At this stage, effort alone is no longer sufficient. Access becomes constrained not by cost, but by absence. Even those with established networks and extensive experience may find that opportunities simply do not arise. When they do, they are often brief, competitive, and highly selective in terms of quality. This introduces a different kind of limitation, not one defined by scarcity in general terms, but by the inability to act on demand. A collector may be ready, informed, and capable of acquiring a specimen, yet still remain unable to do so because the material itself is not present in the market at that moment. California tourmaline at its highest levels exists within that constraint, a category shaped as much by what is no longer found as by what once was. The most significant specimens are often tied to earlier periods of discovery, now held in collections where they rarely reappear. For those seeking similar material today, the challenge is not simply to search more effectively, it is to recognize that certain outcomes are no longer reproducible, and that, despite sustained effort, some pieces remain defined by their absence rather than their availability. Ranked third. Titanite. Formation impossibility. Certain minerals are not defined by how often they are found, but by how unlikely they are to form at all. In these cases, rarity is not the result of limited discovery or reduced supply. It originates at a much earlier stage, within the precise conditions required for the mineral to come into existence in the first place. A clear example of this dynamic can be observed in Titanite. Titanite is known to occur in a range of geological environments, yet the formation of well-defined, high-quality crystals, those with clarity, structure, and visual integrity, depends on a narrow set of variables aligning with unusual precision. Temperature, pressure, chemical composition, and time must all fall within a limited window. Outside of that window, the mineral may still form, but not in a way that produces specimens of notable significance. This distinction is critical. It separates general occurrence from meaningful rarity. While Titanite may be present in various locations, specimens that meet the criteria valued by collectors and researchers remain exceptionally uncommon. The difference is not incremental, it is categorical. Most formations never progress to the stage where crystal development becomes stable, ordered, and visually coherent. Even within suitable environments, disruption is the norm. Minor shifts in surrounding conditions can interrupt growth, alter composition, or prevent crystallization entirely. These interruptions do not produce flawed versions of the same mineral. They produce something else, often less defined, less structured, and less recognizable. As a result, the number of high-quality Titanite specimens remains limited not by extraction, but by probability. The mineral does not fail to appear because it is difficult to locate. It fails to appear because the circumstances required for its formation are rarely sustained long enough to complete the process. For those studying mineral genesis, this introduces a different framework for understanding rarity. It is no longer about how much of a mineral exists in total, but how often the exact sequence of conditions occurs without interruption. Each successful formation represents a convergence that is both temporary and unstable, one that could easily collapse under slightly different circumstances. Titanite, in its most refined form, reflects that convergence, a structure that exists not because it is common, but because for a brief period everything aligned exactly as required. And when viewed from that perspective, rarity is no longer tied to discovery or ownership. It is tied to the likelihood that such alignment could happen again. Ranked second. Spessartine garnet, hidden in plain sight. Familiarity often reduces scrutiny. When a mineral appears within a category that is widely recognized, it is rarely examined beyond its most obvious traits. The mind assigns it to a known group, applies a general understanding, and moves on without questioning the details that might set it apart. This tendency becomes particularly significant when examining certain varieties of Spessartine garnet. Garnet, as a group, is among the most broadly distributed minerals in the world. Its presence spans multiple continents, occurring in a range of colors and compositions. That widespread availability creates a baseline assumption. Garnets are common, accessible, and well understood, but that assumption does not hold across all deposits. Within specific regions of California, Spessartine garnet forms under conditions that differ from the more typical occurrences associated with the group. These localized environments produce crystals with distinct compositional characteristics, often in limited quantities that do not extend beyond narrowly defined geological settings. The result is a form of rarity that does not announce itself, A specimen may be identified correctly at a basic level, recognized as garnet, yet its origin, formation context, and relative scarcity remain overlooked. The classification is accurate but incomplete. What is seen is only part of what is present. This gap between identification and understanding has practical consequences. Specimens have been handled, cataloged, and even collected without full recognition of their significance. In some cases, their value has been assessed based on general expectations of the garnet group rather than the specific conditions that produce them. Such moments are not uncommon. They occur whenever a familiar label conceals an uncommon reality. For those with a deeper focus on mineral formation, this creates an opportunity to reconsider what is being observed. It requires moving beyond surface identification and examining the factors that differentiate one occurrence from another, even within the same mineral family. Spessartine garnet, in this context, represents more than a variation. It represents a limitation, one defined not by visibility, but by attention. Because rarity in this case is not hidden by distance or restriction, it is hidden by recognition itself. And that distinction alters how rarity is perceived, not as something that must be sought in distant or inaccessible places, but as something that may already have been seen without ever being fully understood. In first place, red beryl, belief breaker. The idea of rarity is often anchored to recognition. When a gemstone becomes widely known for its scarcity, that reputation tends to solidify into a fixed belief. Over time, it is repeated, reinforced, and rarely challenged. The result is a hierarchy that feels stable. Certain stones are accepted as rare, while others are assumed to fall below that threshold without further examination. This is where comparison becomes essential. A blue sapphire is frequently cited as one of the most desirable and uncommon gemstones available in the global market. Its presence in high-end jewelry, combined with a long history of cultural and commercial significance, reinforces the perception that it occupies the upper tier of rarity. That perception is not without basis. Yet it exists within a framework shaped by visibility, trade, and demand. To understand the limits of that framework, it is useful to consider a different point of reference, one that is often described as significantly rarer in geological terms, yet far less prominent in public awareness. This is where red beryl enters the discussion. Unlike sapphire, red beryl does not benefit from widespread distribution or consistent availability. Its formation is confined to highly specific environments, and its known occurrences are restricted to a small number of localities. Even within those locations, the production of gem-quality material remains extremely limited. The difference is not merely quantitative, it is structural. Sapphire exists within a global network of deposits, allowing for ongoing discovery, extraction, and circulation. Red beryl does not operate within that system. Its presence is fragmented, its output irregular, and its accessibility constrained by conditions that are rarely replicated. This creates a contrast that challenges the initial assumption. A gemstone, widely recognized as rare, may still be encountered, studied, and acquired through established channels. Another, less familiar mineral may exist in far smaller quantities, yet remain largely absent from those same channels. The implication is not that one replaces the other in value or importance. It is that rarity cannot be assessed solely through reputation. Red beryl serves as an early indication of that shift, a reference point that begins to separate perceived rarity from actual occurrence, revealing that the scale itself extends beyond what is commonly understood. And once that distinction is made, the expectation changes. What was once considered rare becomes relative, and what follows begins to redefine the meaning entirely. By the end of this scale, rarity no longer behaves the way most expect. What begins as a comparison to a blue sapphire gradually becomes something less predictable, less visible, less accessible, and in some cases barely present at all. Some of these minerals can still be found with time and effort. Others exist only within specific places, under conditions that are unlikely to repeat. And a few remain at the edge of probability, formed once and rarely encountered again. That shift changes the definition entirely. Rarity is no longer about value or even availability. It becomes a question of whether something can be experienced at all. Because beyond a certain point, the difference between discovering one of these minerals and never seeing it in a lifetime is almost indistinguishable. And that may be the most accurate measure of rarity there is. If this way of looking at minerals feels different, there is more to uncover, far beyond what is commonly recognized.